Your Excellency, thanks for your time. Welcome to CNBC.
Thank you very much for having me.
What impact has the Russia-Ukraine war had on the UAE's food security strategy broadly?
Well, one of the things that we have focused on because of the COVID-19 pandemic is to make sure that we diversify our import sources for the different commodities that we import and we consume here in the United Arab Emirates. And so part of that strategy as well was to make sure that we have enough strategic reserves just in case something does happen in the future. So that strategy during that period of time has actually protected the UAE and its food security during the current conflict.
And this is important because the UAE imports 80 to 90% of its food. So what steps has the country taken to reduce import reliance and to build self-sufficiency as well?
Well, I wouldn't focus on self-sufficiency in the region because as a concept, and even as something that was turned into programs or self-sufficiency policies, so on and so forth, you wouldn't really see any clearly successful example of that happening. So any country that would get into self-sufficiency, they would do it for some time, and then they would realize that it's either too costly or they can't sustain it in the long term, and they would just go ahead and try to balance things out between imports and food production. So here in the UAE, we do understand that food imports will always be a significant component of our food security strategy. But at the same time, we are looking into what can we produce without necessarily having to pay so much doing so. So yes, we will continue to import, but then what kind of food can be produced here at a reasonable cost and is accessible to the population?
So what steps did the UAE take through these twin crises of COVID-19 and now more recently Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impact that this has had on food supply systems to protect its own food security?
The main thing that we have done during the COVID-19 pandemic is establish what is termed or coined as a food corridor between ourselves and different countries around the globe. And from each of those countries, they needed certain things during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this was one of the classic examples of barter trade. You would trade certain things that they need from you, and they would send you food commodities that you need to import into the United Arab Emirates. And that kind of concept was developed further to serve us even better moving forward as a bigger component of our food security strategy, rather than it just being a small part or something that we use as a contingency plan during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that has been one major component of our food security strategy, or is part of our food security strategy moving forward. Number two is diversifying our sources of food imports. So making sure that, yes, we do import our food, but can we make sure that we import our food from as many countries as possible, just to make sure that if for whatever reason one source cannot supply us with the food that we need, we can definitely get it elsewhere. Number three is the focus on agri-tech and seeing how can certain food commodities be produced at a low cost or allow us to produce them efficiently, effectively, and at the same time, it's not more expensive than if we have imported that food commodity from elsewhere.
And we see risks continuing to build around the region. Why do you think other countries in this part of the world haven't been as successful as the UAE when it comes to building food supply chain resilience and developing a national food security strategy to protect against risks and shocks like Russia's war in Ukraine?
I think it's very important that every country is aware of what works for them best. So there are quite a few countries in the region who are able to produce their own food. And the question is, at what cost? So if you look at the region from the 1920s, 30s, 40s onwards, you would always see a country trying to produce a certain commodity at a massive scale and then scaling it back. You would always see announcements of self-sufficiency programs, and most of those did not succeed in any way. And even those that succeeded for a short period of time, and then they tend to become very costly, or they prove to be very costly in comparison to what kind of self-sufficiency they provide to the country in question. So once you understand this, you start to plan your food security around, I'm good at producing this, And so I will produce it, and I will make sure that my sufficiency level is at so and so. And what I'm not good at producing or anything else that I'm missing, I'm going to import it, but I'm going to import it from as many countries as possible. And doing so for us was important from the very beginning. And I don't think this is something that it's absolutely something that you can copy. It's absolutely something that you can do. But then you need to make sure that you plan it way ahead of time so that you're aware of this, you're able to accommodate it within your food security strategy. And your food security strategy is not entirely or mostly based on your food production, which can fluctuate based on are you able to get fertilizers? Is the water sources enough for you to sustain it, especially with the drought that we see almost everywhere during this period?
How concerned are you by the food security situation in the region today?
I would like to say, and this is my personal opinion, that food security will always be a matter of concern in the region. And the reason why this is the case is if you look at the connection between food prices and food rioting or food protesting or bread rioting in the region, you would see that there is quite some sort of a correlation, not necessarily a causation, but definitely a correlation between food prices going up and things taking a whole different direction in the region. And once you see this and you're aware of this, you need to be focused on how can I make sure that I mitigate such a risk and stabilize the region as much as possible, because as a country like the United Arab Emirates, you cannot be or continue to be stable and to flourish in a region that is unstable. And so when we look at our food security, we also look at our food security as part of the region's food security. And our focus also on food security is making sure that the region is able to be food secure, just to make sure that the region overall is stable and not just one or two countries in the region.
And food security is national security. Do you see a risk that growing hunger here could destabilize the region in any way, particularly if the bread baskets of Russia and Ukraine become less reliable in the future?
There's absolutely a connection here. And this is why I mentioned in the earlier answer that, you know, whenever there is a rise in the price of the staple commodity of a country, you would absolutely see some sort of bread rioting or food protesting taking place right after. And so if we know that there is such a connection, then our focus should be that food prices should remain at a reasonable level that allows the population to access that food. For us to do so, obviously food production is one component for countries that can produce food as long as they can do it at a reasonable cost. But at the same time, where can we get the food from without having to overpay for it? So what happened during the recent crisis is that those countries in MENA region had been excessively over-reliant on the two sources for their wheat imports. And what they have done recently, just to make sure that they avoid any kind of food security related issues, is that they started overpaying for the food that they were importing from other sources that they could find around the region or even further away. Now, the question is, if you were able to import that food from such sources because of the crisis, why can't you make sure that those countries are part of your food import sources overall moving forward, just to make sure that whenever there's such an issue in the future, you can actually avoid it?
And so what are some practical steps that can be taken to rein in prices, which is obviously a major concern, but also bolster food security broadly across the region?
Well, it's very important to make sure that whatever policy that a country follows with regard to its food security is actually a consistent policy. When I mentioned earlier the self-sufficiency programs, the problem is you cannot initiate a program knowing that this program is not going to be a success in the future. So before doing so, you need to be aware of, okay, this is what I'm good at, this is what I can do. I want to make sure that I'm not wasting my money trying to produce a commodity that I cannot produce for the next 50 years. And that kind of money can cushion the country during a crisis like the crisis that we're seeing right now with regards to food security. So in such a case, what the country should be doing is making sure that food prices domestically do not fluctuate. Meaning, even when prices internationally or around the globe are going up, how can I make sure that my domestic prices are maintained within a certain range that is okay for the population to pay, and is not going to cause me or is not going to cause hunger or food insecurity in the region? To do so, this means that in certain instances, the government would need to intervene and subsidize the food up to a certain extent just to keep it at a certain level. And at the same time, when food prices internationally are too low, there are always ways for the government to make its money back. So this way, you have a stable domestic food price level, even if the food price level around the globe is going up and down.
And we've spoken about some of the pressures facing food supply systems and undermining food security in the region today. Do you think there's any relief on the horizon?
I think when the crisis first happened, which is very similar to the COVID-19 pandemic, it was very difficult for supply chains to adjust. So where should certain products, commodities be coming from? Where are they going? Everyone was scrambling to get whatever that they can get their hands on. Now, after there being a few months since the crisis or the conflict erupted, I think that kind of settling down or settling into some sort of, I wouldn't say equilibrium, but a better state than where we used to be is happening to a certain extent, but we're not there yet. So it's going to take some time before all of those countries who are over-reliant on certain sources for their wheat and other food commodities to be able to adjust, to be able to import the food from elsewhere. And this will also be subject to whether or not there is enough food that is being produced, because I'm pretty sure this is one of the things that you have seen as well, that there was an assumption that certain countries will be able to fill in the gaps. But with the current drought, that is also another question mark.
So do you think this could be months, perhaps years, if not even longer, before we see any kind of relief on the horizon?
It will definitely take a few months before we can see that there's some sort, I wouldn't say a relief, but some sort of, okay, now it's a stabilized situation rather than it being all over the place.
Your Excellency, really appreciate your time today. Thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much.